Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar that we are hosting with the Mail and Guardian. I'm from DDP, and we are funded by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, so they are also funding this. We hope you all join and you have a wonderful session and you take something back that is useful. Every year in August, to mark our Women's Month, we have a webinar or a conference. We pay tribute to the more than 20,000 women who marched to the Union Building on the 9th of August 1956 in protest of the extension of the pass laws to women. Their passionate commitment to see women liberated and acknowledged as active shapers of our democracy and development is palpable today as it was in their days. This struggle hasn't ended. Today, women are still marginalized in society. They are excluded from leadership in the corporate and the public sectors. The just released quarterly labor force survey indicated that there are more unemployed women, 36.8%, compared to men, which are only 32.4%. The situation is even worse when de-aggregated according to race, with unemployment higher among African Black women, 41%. Compared to other race groups. The point is, it is women who are bearing the brunt of the failed development policies. Moreover, the fight against gender-based violence and femicide remains an ongoing one and is nowhere near the end. The recent crime statistics released by the South African Police Force shows the extent of the challenge we continue to face in securing the safety of women in this country. DDP bemoans the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide in our country, and especially during Women's Month. This is shocking. It is unacceptable and everything must be done to curb the scourge. It is against this background that DDP, in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Mail and Guardian, co-hosted this event to mobilize every citizen in the fight against women exclusion and violence. We need all hands on deck. It is our sincere hope that this webinar awakens all of us to free the lives of women to live without fear and that they are appreciated as equal development practitioners and decision makers, capable of leading society into greater heights of success and prosperity. Hope you enjoy this webinar. I thank you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Lynn, and really appreciate the DDP hosting this important webinar in the month of August, which is Women's Month, but also to showcase the successes, but the challenges. My name is Sinusha Naidu. I have the pleasure this afternoon to be the moderator of this very important, very timely, very contemporary webinar on women in leadership, politics and empowerment, and what the future holds in terms of equity. I'm a senior research associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue. I think, ladies and gentlemen, as Lynn has very eloquently set the tone for us for this webinar, the focus of the discussion today is really to reflect on the journey traveled since 1994. Where is it that we find women in politics, in society, in the economic sphere, as well as in the private sphere with regard to their emancipation, their rights, their kind of ability to enjoy their active citizenry as the majority of citizens, the majority of the population in South Africa. I think in this week, we were saddened to see and still very shocked to hear how much gender-based violence still is a serious blight on our society, blight on our democracy, and more importantly, not just gender-based violence, but the actual brutality of how this violence is taking place. I think these are insurmountable hurdles where women find themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. The fact that they still have to consider themselves challenged in the economic sphere, challenged in the political sphere, but also in the private sphere. The fact that institutions tend to overlook their ability, overlook the fact that women are still facing the kind of destruction and the brutality that they face with their well-being as mothers, as partners, as professionals, as people in positions of power, as community leaders. I think these multiple roles that they play in society often get eclipsed by this ongoing kind of debate about the narrative, about the actual issues that are being dealt with. I think one of the very important things that we must remember is women are the fabric of society. They're the backbone of every household, every country, and in the world at large. And I think I'm very privileged to be able to sit with with the group of women that are going to be speaking today in the panel, who are going to be providing an overview. They share their experiences, talk about what it is to be celebrating Women's Month, and whether or not we have the kind of tangibles, the kind of challenges, the kind of successes that we should be celebrating, and where it is that we're going in this trajectory and this path with regard to politics, governance, leadership, just to name a few of the challenges still that confront women in today's society, not just in South Africa, I think in the region, in the continent, and the world at large. In every society, I think women and children still face unbearable challenges to their empowerment. So without further ado, I want to basically start with the program. And first, let me just apologize. We've had a shift in the program. Judith February, who was supposed to be part of the program, had to basically had an unforeseen circumstance, so the program has changed. I'm privileged to be moderating the program with three very dynamic women, professional leaders, private leaders in their own right, and who will talk about some of the challenges that we have, but also to reflect on the last 25, 27 years of where we are in terms of this discourse of women in politics, but women also as professionals, women also as leaders in terms of our future trajectory. Let me first introduce Professor Pearl Sotola. She is an author, a gender and development specialist, a social anthropologist expert. She is based with the University of Free State, if I'm right. And more importantly, I think she's been quite an active voice in terms of the rights of women when it comes to land, when it comes to issues around the implications that land rights have, women owning land, and also in terms of what it is that we have to think about when we talk about women in both the private and the professional space. Pearl, I'm so happy to have you on the panel with me today. You have about 15 minutes to present your views on these issues, but also things that you think are pertinent that we should be keeping a watching brief on in terms of where we are in the context of Women's Month and what we are celebrating and what we are not basically seeing in terms of the empowerment of women. Over to you, Pearl.
Thank you very much, Sanusha, for that introduction. Thank you to the DDP and Male Guardian for putting us together to yet again reflect on the plight of women in South Africa. This particular webinar is happening at the back of what we've seen a somber moment that has affected us at from what we have been seeing in the last week in relation to what has happened at Fort Hare. I sit here and wonder as I look at all of the discussions around the plight of women with regards to GBV in South Africa, and just wonder how is it that we are unable to solve? Because actually, when you look at the history of where we come from with talking, the history of where we come from with planning, there is just this block to solving that one has to ponder a moment and find out, how is it possible that we can't solve? Where do we start with solving if we are actually to use anything that we've created by way of tools that we change regularly in the name of gender inequality. And so I have been looking at this and looking at reactions. At some point, I saw a TV presenter who asked the question to the nation and said, what is at the core of GBV? And there were so many responses that were directed back at her. And most of these responses were basically citing patriarchy, they were citing gender inequality, they were citing socialization of men into dominance, and other variable responses that are linked to that. And so one can see that actually we know what the problem is as a society as well. I mean, these responses were coming from people of all walks of life within South Africa. The most disappointing responses in relation to this that I have seen are actually from the state, and in particular, the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. Because what they had to say and offer in relation to why is this happening, even in other discussions, not the one that had the presenter who threw that question, was that actually we have taken some strides. And we now have a national strategic plan on gender-based violence and femicide. And I looked at this and wondered and asked myself, why would a government department faced with such a crisis, not only in 2021, but for some years now, be telling its citizens about backroom work, actually, which is what any strategy is? Why would I be impressed as a woman seeing what I was looking at and feeling about the Fort Hare situation, be consoled by the fact that the department that deals with these matters has a national strategy towards it, and that is what they are offering, and not being able to articulate in concrete terms in relation to my experience what that plan entails and or how far it is that the execution of that plan might actually promise anything to alleviate this. So in essence, the society knows that women are second-class citizens, to use a Mecheta, and the only problem that we have actually is how is it that we don't translate that knowledge into something that makes us understand in the first instance why we end up stuck in this inequality status, and two, what is to be done about it. And so, program director, I'm not actually wanting to dwell in the violence, even though it is one of the things that require an intervention. I want to dwell on the resounding failure of officialdom to deal with gender inequality. And in dealing with that, because, you know, it's difficult to come to solutions without having named the problem, I'm actually hoping that in analysis of this, we will have we will see what solutions are implied. I decided that I want to demonstrate the dilemma that we are in as a country by addressing the ultimate first-class citizen, actually. And in a rhetorical sense, and you're going to have to bear through this address to this first-class, ultimate first-class citizen for your sins. I'm writing a letter that says, Dear Mr. President, your country has been, or has never actually, had a woman president, ever. Your country has not had a female minister of finance, and we are not sure why. We do want to ask, because, or we do not want to ask because we know the strange potential answers, and they will range from pointing back at the citizens for not voting women leaders into a leading party, or global markets level of unhappiness or interest with the choice of the Minister of Finance in particular. We see then that institutional patriarchy is a reality. Mr. President, the genesis of your country's existence seems to have reduced the options of economic survival rather than increase them. The country is applauded for championing human rights and human dignity, but it also protects private property without correcting history in terms of material dispossession of the indigenous community. The Constitution has also emasculated the indigenous community cognitively as well, since the dominance of individual property as the only way of doing things has demoted communality of land from the basket of options. All of this within a system that favors male identity and male surnames. The intellectual system of the country is heavily supportive of individualistic capitalism. He's underscored the individualistic system of social relations. Anything else is unfashionable and backward. Yet, Mr. President, I want to create an analogy between your space of governance with the family. Like a patriarchal family, you are presiding over a system where men are the first citizens and you are the household head. Women are supporting citizens, just supporting the men, the neck of the household. The head is always male. The quest of economic survival is associated with men. Professional specialization is actually male, and this relates to the history of capitalism as well. Exactly the reason why your finance portfolio cannot warm up to women, because the quest for economic survival, even as reflected by your government, is actually male. Women neg in portfolios of social development, small businesses, and occasionally defense, just so that the massification of women to legitimize the system is evident. They are like good wives in the household. They work just enough to make things happen in the ordinary spaces. The system you preside over, Mr. President, confirms for the society that women are responsible for ordinariness and men are responsible for professional specialization and authority, as exemplified by the presidency and the Minister of Finance portfolio. Why it is worse in South Africa is because in that society, religion and culture tend to be too fundamentalist, and this helps your symbolic status as head of a patriarchal South African family. It is actually quite fitting reference, therefore, to talk of a family meeting when you address all of us over COVID-19 management occasionally. Mr. President, the entire system is patriarchal. You, the head, and Ibandla, the global forces that dictate the appointment of your finance and economic headmen, speak down to the nation occasionally through national strategic plans that are top-down. Such plans are financed by that Ibandla if they make sense to it and its systems. Your systems float above social reality because women are only allowed into the system in your own terms. Their experience of daily dance with circumstances is not considered relevant in your planning. Thank you, Mr. President, for the ear. we hope you consider humanizing the strategies and perhaps letting the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities work genuinely through civil society bodies, community structures, churches, stokvel groups, taxi associations, as well as engendering the portfolios of finance and presidency, as well as economic development. Thank you. Let me, after this letter, then quickly come back. I hope I'm not in a crisis of time management, program director, but let me quickly come back to summarizing the unspoken social understanding and omissions that make up the kind of patriarchal society that South Africa is. The quest of resources is male, care is female. That's one. Secondly, women are associated with ordinariness, male entitled to support as first citizens. Thirdly, capitalism was crafted around breadwinning and profession being male, actually, as globally, it was like that, it is like that. This is the fundamental principle of capitalism, and capitalism lets women in as a favor. And this speaks to the kinds of things that Lynn was talking about with regards to who gets more affected with unemployment. Anything indigenous has no value, actually, in South Africa. We've seen that recently during the pandemic, but generally it affects women more. Ordinary people thinking and options are not regarded as a substance that matters and substance that evolves. The issue of communality of land and the evolution of that space to include women is actually not seen as something important. Actually, in some spaces, women are allowed to have land within communal spaces. However, because the whole idea of the communal land system is being thrown out because it is indigenous and unfashionable, we actually lose everything that is options for women in all of that. Privatization of subjugation is actually where I am driving to with this, because the subjugation of women is actually so privatized that violence is unable to tackle because it is in the private space, that strategic plans are actually omitting all of the nuances of dealing with those kinds of things and gender intervention because those things are too social to be able to be worked into the strategic plan. And I challenge you to go and read that national strategic plan that is being flaunted every day in the face of people who are suffering, and check whether it studies masculinities and liaises with churches about the enforcement, their enforcement of women's subjugation, actually, because the church plays a big role in terms of enforcing subjugation. Check whether it deals with substance abuse and it's linked to violence. Conversations around culture and how it objectifies women and how those will actually be tackled in all of those 6 pillars that it propounds. Check whether the discussion of specific issues such as ukutwala of women actually find space in that as projects that will be done in specific communities that are associated with such practices. Do check there whether the trivialization of women's contribution in institutions, the trauma of the double day will be engaged with. In fact, it has taken COVID-19 pandemic to combine work and home, where in fact it is possible. Check whether engagement with traditional leaders on women's access to land is in there, as well as whether the engagement with the capitalist diaspora, which chooses ministers for us sometimes, is actually going to let us renegotiate Section 25, because that is not just being held back by specific prescripts of how you change the Constitution. We know who has major interest in this, and we are scared of their wrath. Check whether that particular strategy is speaking of decentralization of the economy via municipalities in order to minimize the gap between women's pursuit of economic pursuit and managing ordinariness, which just happens to be with us, whether we believe it is natural or not. I am driving towards conclusion, Program Director, and I want to cite 3 main issues that would actually better inform a way forward in terms of engendering interventions, strategic interventions in South Africa. And these 3 issues are an approach to gender intervention and to the rage of South African men has to recognize that the rights-based approach is good, but actually in the context where religion and culture works against it on a daily basis, it is actually an affront to propose access to economic independence, emphasis on rights, access to professional authority to men in a country where men have been promised that women are second and supporting citizens. There needs to be a dialogue on Ubuntu accompanying the rights-based approach, a very deliberate one. Secondly, unless we are willing to ruffle the feathers in the dissociation of ordinariness and formality, we will not solve the burden of the double day for women and the tensions it creates for them. And yet it is exactly that proximity to ordinariness that injects new qualities into spaces of formality. Unfortunately, the HR systems are napping, the sector plans are napping in terms of designing ways that are women-friendly in engaging with the workspace. Sectors all the way to local government, given that the major plans are not conscious enough of the need to actually make local spaces more economically friendly for women's reach to both spaces. Thirdly and lastly, an approach to gender in South Africa has to be genuine towards discovering the quagmire of social issues that enrage men, specifically in the space of spousal relationships, because there's something about that particular space. I haven't had too many, although there are instances of mother-child kind of matters, even though I know that they have. The spousal relationships must gain a specific focus to find out in the social myriad of things why it is, at what point do the promises to men and the things that we want to do with society become at odds with each other in a form that enrages men the way that they are. One study that where my eyes and ears are glued up when it's done is the study by this Commission on Gender Equality on fathers that are denied parenting, and they've said that there are issues there. So we want to perhaps find a way of seeing, having insight into what is going on that enrages men so much. Thank you very much, Program Director. I rest my case here.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was really quite enlightening. I'm looking forward to the letter that you're going to send to the first citizen of the country. I think you've really captured the essence of what's going on and really questioning the juxtapositions we find ourselves in. I don't want to go too much into kind of paraphrasing or providing an overview of what you said. I want to come back to that in the discussion, and I think we have a lot of points to raise there. I want to welcome the Democracy Development Program Director, who is with us now. Welcome, and it's wonderful to have you online, as well as welcome the next panelist, which is a young activist, which I'm very privileged to have met, and feel very privileged to have on this forum, Ayaka Melitafa. She is the youngest commissioner for the Presidential Climate Change Committee. She's got her own foundation, and she's a non-executive director at the African Climate Alliance. Ayaka is a social justice activist. She's involved in the activism of young people, the millennial generation, the way in which younger women are looking at their role in society. And I think she essentially comes quite nicely after Prof. Sotola, because I think at the end of the day, what Prof was actually putting together in terms of an overview and challenging some of these questions about second citizen ordinariness and the juxtaposition of how women are defined in a capitalist society of who are the breadwinners. And we know that in most times it's women that are actually at the forefront of providing for their families, and not just in terms of care, but also in the whole kind of context of the economic landscape. I think Ayaka represents that next generation. And in this context, we, as part of her discussion, it will be really nice to get a sense of how young women are looking at the challenges that they currently face. What are some of the issues that they face as women that are basically looking towards that empowerment? And the question of how do they deal with this issue around this professionalization and this very male-centric workspace, professional space, private space, etc., that we find ourselves in. So over to you, Ayaka. In addition to those issues around how do we deal with the role of young women in social justice struggles and their future in leadership and governance, I think just share your experience, and it's your 15 minutes to just give us how you have basically seen these challenges that Prof has characterized for us and sketched out for us in your activism and your issues in terms of not just climate change, but also in terms of young people and the governance question. Over to you.
Yes, hi, it's very lovely to be here. I appreciate being in this space. My name is Ayaka Melitafa. And before we dive into women and how we deal with the challenges that come with being women in South Africa, I'd just like to share a little bit of my story. I'm Ayaka Melitafa. I'm a climate justice activist. I basically began my journey when I was around 16, when Cape Town, the Western Cape, was facing the water crisis. We were very close to day zero. And I was so concerned, like, how is this happening? And I was so confused at the fact that this that's happening around us is not something that's normal. It's not something that is supposed to happen. Yes, we've had droughts in the past, but at this magnitude is definitely something that's not normal. And what made me pay attention to that is the fact that my mom is a small-scale farmer. So she notices weather patterns, she notices rain patterns, she notices how animals react to the rain patterns, and that basically tells us that we are moving in the wrong direction. And really what forced me to actually come into this space and actually challenge the norms that we were living in is the fact that I saw how hard my mom was working every single day to make sure that we don't lose our income. Because as there was a drought, it's incredibly hard for small-scale farmers to get water to feed their cattle, to feed their crops, and to basically produce stock that actually helps them grow. And since the drought hit us so hard, it was very hard to adjust to those conditions. So we just had to bear and make do with what we have. And that was so unfair because we saw how our neighbors, our white neighbors that did more commercial farming, how they just drilled boreholes and then they used it. For them, it continued as business as usual. And unfortunately, that is the reality that we are living in. Women, especially farmers that are small scale, will always be overlooked. And the focus will always go to people that are privileged, people that are male, and people that are white. That's something we just cannot escape. So through me seeing how hard my mom was trying to provide and put food on the table, it forced me to actually stand up and make a change. That's when I went to the internet. That's when I went to books in the library, and that's when I found out about climate change. I found out that global warming is real. I found out that our planet is going towards catastrophic times that we can't even reverse ourselves if we don't change the way that we are living. And for me, all of that information being thrown in my face and me finding out all of those facts, it really upset me. And it put me in a state of climate depression or climate anxiety, where every day you wake up asking yourself, what's the point of living? What's the point of moving forward? What's the point of even trying when the world is going to end anyway and no one is listening? It put me in such a debilitating state that my mom started to notice that my patterns, I was no longer a bubbly girl. I was no longer going out. I was no longer enjoying the simple things that I used to enjoy, like going out and sitting on the field or going out and go feeding the chickens. And that was because I was in this state of darkness and knowing that, why aren't people caring? Why isn't someone else talking about this? And that was really hard for me until I think in 2017, I was in grade 11. I joined Project 90 by 2030, which is an environmental organization that was introduced to us by our school. And I was very lucky to be in that program because I finally had the opportunity to be around people that understand the severity of the climate crisis. I was around people that understood and had the same values as me, that wanted to make the same change as me. And that really helped me in terms of my anxiety and my climate depression, because I finally understood that this is what it means to actually actively stand up and take change and make a stand for yourself. And that's basically how I rose in my journey, being a climate justice activist, but not just a climate justice activist. I'm a social justice activist that has an emphasis on Pan-Africanism, on women and race as well. So for me, when it comes to the challenges that comes with being a young woman in South Africa and the patriarchy that we're living in and the capitalistic system that keeps on beating us down every time we try to pick ourselves up, I've noticed quite a couple of things. Firstly, for me, being a climate justice activist in this field, I will not say that it was hard for me to get here and it was hard for me to be noticed. I feel like the fact that I had a passion for it and I knew from the beginning what I wanted to do, that made it easy for me to be able to put myself in spaces to get recognition, or put myself in spaces where I can be the voice of the people, be the voice of the farmers, people that really don't know how to articulate these things. I mean, like, one thing that I've noticed from a young age, even from my mother, we understand that there's a lot of things going wrong in the environment, but then we are pressured to stay resilient. We don't know where to complain. We don't know who to complain to. So we don't have any choice but to be resilient. But as time is going by and as we are in the Gen Z generation, we are realizing that we can't use resilience as an excuse anymore. There comes a time where we have to stop being resilient and stand up and understand that what we are in is not normal. It's not caused by us, certain people actually in that sense. And we need to stop it in its tracks before it destroys our livelihoods and it destroys the futures of us and future generations to come. So the challenges that I have faced as a climate justice activist that's Black and young and that's a woman are the facts that every time you walk into a room, people are asking, what's this girl doing here? Like, what can she add to the table? I normally am in spaces where I'm around scientists, big men, ministers, presidents, and then I shrink because I ask myself, what do they think I'm here to contribute to the table? How hard do I have to fight to be seen in this room? What do I have to do as a young person to make sure that my voice is heard, not listened to, but heard? So I'm not going to lie, as we are approaching this Gen Z generation of young people standing up, creating immense change, young people challenging stereotypes, young people challenging the norms, I feel like this is a great place for me to be in. Because personally speaking, since we're in this Gen Z generation where people are standing up for themselves and standing up for their rights, it empowers me to actually do research about myself, to do research about what's happening around me, and to be able to use that research in my climate advocacy space. For example,
think we lost Ayaka due to possibly the weather and a bad connection. Maybe we can just give her a couple of minutes to get back on, and then in the meantime, can I ask Mabel if she just wants to come in and maybe just pick up on a few points that she was able to discern from both Prof. Sotola as well as Ayaka's presentation, and then we can come back later as well. Thank you, Mabel.
Thank you, Sanusha. I had prepared a few points as well, just to talk to some of the rule of law and social justice issues that had been highlighted in the program. And I'll also talk, of course, to Prof. Sitola's contribution as well as Ayaka so far. And I think she still has some important points to bring into the conversation. But I'd really like to say thank you for the opportunity. The challenges and war on inclusive democratic governance inevitably lead to violence and conflict that has devastating effects on women and girls who constitute the majority of Africa's population. Although we celebrate shifts towards greater gender equality, and there are examples in Rwanda and South Africa to some extent, and I'll talk to this in more detail in a little bit, even though women occupy senior leadership positions, there remain several barriers to overall participation and engagement of women in governance and in conflict prevention, for example. The former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, recently pointed out that women face the same barriers in peace processes that they face in political processes. As a continent, we've celebrated UN Resolution 1325 and our own Maputo Protocol, and this remains one of the most progressive legal instruments that provides a comprehensive set of human rights for African women. Despite these advances, Zipporah Musau argues that women's bodies are battlefields in times of peace as well as in times of conflict. And this is very disturbing. In my own research of liberation movements in the region, I've found that women in the liberation movement were not only major players in attaining democracy, something that has largely been written out of our histories and our learning about the past, they were also victims of sexual violence within the ranks of the movements that they were fighting with and for. In Zimbabwe, Faye Chang, who was a member of the liberation movement, witnessed the use of women freedom fighters as what she described as warm blankets for senior commanders, which basically meant that when senior commanders entered a military camp, they would decide which female freedom fighters they would sleep with that night because they needed, quote unquote, a warm blanket. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project in 2019, the threat of political violence is also growing against women. Women are targeted in the course of or as a weapon of war. Outside of conventional conflict, women are targeted where states enforce order through repression, as we've seen in Burundi and Zimbabwe with the activists in these countries. Sexual violence remains the leading type of violence targeting women in Africa. It accounts for more than 42% of all violence targeting women in the continent. In Nigeria, in 2018, a Fulani militia raped a woman in Anambra over land issues. Prof also talked to land issues and land rights and access. This is a big problem. Abductions and forced disappearances are comparatively more common in Africa relative to other regions, where they make up 10% of all political violence targeting women. Unidentified armed groups, in particular political militias, are the primary perpetrators of violence against women in Africa. They are masked in secrecy and are not held accountable for their crimes. We've also witnessed a spike in domestic gender-based violence, as we've heard from Prof as well during the COVID-19 pandemic, and women continue to have limited access to safe spaces away from the perpetrators of this abuse. I think we're not asking enough questions about what can be done to address this. With each lockdown, the more severe the lockdown, the higher the chances women are not able to access safe spaces. But how can we address this? Although women are driving solutions at the community level, their voices and efforts are overshadowed by the dominance of patriarchal systems. Prof also talked to this. There is need to create more spaces for women's experiences and actions to influence continental, regional, national, and local efforts around gender justice and gender equality in all spheres of society. The dialogue that we're having today is an important platform to raise the issues and also hear from the floor potential solutions. In my experience with women's leadership development programs, especially those targeting women in local government politics, as well as women in the rule of law and social justice sector, building networks of solidarity is one way to help women to share their stories in quote unquote safer spaces. It has emerged through these programs that I've been involved with in planning and implementing that sometimes women also perpetuate masculinized practices and patriarchy itself. This limits women's full participation in our systems, in our institutions. Additionally, the notion of power, who holds it and who uses it to exercise influence, is critical. At all levels of leadership, the literature tells us that there remains low representation of women in decision making. Globally, 3/4 of parliamentarians are still men. To some extent, Africa is credited for pushing women's representation in political decision-making power. Amongst the world's 20 countries with the greatest female representation in parliament, 7 of these are from Africa. This includes, of course, Rwanda, which I mentioned earlier. And in Rwanda, there are 64% of parliamentarians are women. The increase in women's representation in other countries, however, on the continent still falls short of the AU's calls for 50% of women to be represented at all levels of decision-making. However, the inclusion of women in politics and power by way of empirical representation does not always translate to higher outcomes that lead to greater gender inclusion and overall transformation. More specifically, it is acknowledged that within structures of governance, there is institutionalized resistance to attain gender equity. And this is in full agreement with Prof's point as well about the institutionalization of patriarchy. It's also important to note that representation of women in the rule of law sector remains very low. In 2014, a report by the Center of Applied Legal Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand revealed that senior positions in the legal sector are still dominated by white men. And Ayaka talked to this as well in terms of business and agriculture. In their study, 80% of chief executives from a sample of 12 South African firms were white men. The Constitutional Court Review, published by the South African Legal Information Institute, reinforces that argument that the transformation challenge permeates all sectors and is evidenced by higher numbers of men in the judiciary, including South Africa's Constitutional Court at the time of publication. The review also posited that women academics, lawyers who practice as advocates or attorneys, and judges as well, face a number of challenges that continue to keep them from assuming more influential roles within the court. The gap between increased women's representation in political decision-making and the realization of policy outcomes that directly benefit women continues to be a major cause for concern. However, the way in which women are equipped to assume power and assert influence is important to overcome persistent obstacles. Furthermore, women who manage to overcome these obstacles, in my opinion, have a greater responsibility to mentor and raise up more women leaders, to open up space for greater inclusion, and to raise daughters who know that their voices matter, and to raise sons who love, respect, and honor women in our society. It's also important for men to be included in these processes. There are men who are feminists. Men have an important role to play in modeling alternative ways of being and doing that do not suppress but support women as equals in the home, in the work environment, and in the broader society. Prof also talked to the need to humanize women and girls. You know, when we read about gender-based violence, about maternal mortality, infant mortality, because of the great deficiency we have in our society, in our implementation of policies, transparency and accountability in how budgets are distributed and used or not, to benefit our people for the public good. the statistics actually represent people. And I think the question of humanization of corruption and the impact it really has, and in this instance on women and girls, is a priority. We actually need to hear more stories and publish them so that we're aware that each statistic we read about is a story, is a life that has been impacted. Secondly, when looking at the COVID-19 situation and the way our system of capitalism and patriarchy benefits already privileged groups, men in that are included in that group, it's important to protect our informal traders, not only in South Africa, but beyond, because the majority of informal traders who run informal businesses are women. And it's not just young women, it's elderly women, some who are grandmothers who are struggling to look after their grandchildren that they have custody or are looking after because their parents are unable to do so, for whatever the reason may be. And in addition to Prof. Sotola's comments around the deficit between policies and implementation, we need to talk about gender responsive budgeting, which makes resources available to support women and girls critical. Without budgets and resources, there's no way any plan can be implemented. And without transparent and accountable implementation, this will not be possible. And Pregs Govender is one person who advocated for this as a member of parliament in South Africa. If you haven't read her book, Love and Courage, A Story of Insubordination, please do, because it really sheds a light to some of the issues that we're facing today that haven't been solved since 94 and even before that. Gender equality must be enacted as a principle in all legal frameworks. And the IMF itself notes that gender responsive budgeting is still in its infancy in our region, in Southern Africa, in its infancy, meaning it's actually a priority for us to see how we implement this. And I'm not sure if it's a question of political will or a question of not enough resources or understanding about how to do it. I don't think that's the case. We need a greater political commitment to gender responsive budgeting moving forward. Ayaka's contribution was very touching as she spoke about her mother as a farmer, a smallholder farmer. And that is the story of many women in Africa. And it just reminded me of the inequality in the climate justice space itself, how this also has been capitalized when we talk about renewables, alternative energy, and who drives this process. We find that big business is actually influencing what politicians and policymakers adopt as a strategy, further enriching people who are still connected as well to oil and gas and other methods of acquiring energy that are destructive to our environment and to our solar system. Conservation methods as well, when talking about natural resource governance, exclude the voices of the communities that depend on those resources for their survival, be it water, land, or minerals. And it is time, and I know this has been happening to some extent, but to find ways to include these voices, as Ayaka has been working hard at doing, in the broader discussions about what the solutions are. We need to Africanize that debate. We need our communities who are looking for solutions and applying localized methods to be able to inform how we address this without adopting strategies that we know are still detrimental to the environment. So for now, Sanusha, I'll leave it there and allow Ayaka, if she is back, to make her contribution.
Mabel, thank you so much. I mean, I think you really captured the salient issues, and I apologize for not introducing you properly. I was caught a bit unawares there. But Mabel is a professional musician, which I think is really great. And I'd love to hear more about that in our Q&A and our general discussion. She's also a human rights public policy development practitioner, and she's with the Building Bridges program with the Nelson Mandela School of Governance at the University of Cape Town. So Mabel, thank you so much. I mean, we'll come back to some of those core debates you raised about, budgeting responsive issues, questions around the professional and private space, cross-border trade. I have a few questions around this border management agency and how that's going to work around regional trade and cross-border trade issues, dealing with visas and dealing with institutions at the border and so forth. But let me go back to Ayaka so that she could, continue with that very insightful and illuminating discussion she was giving us about her perspective as a young woman in this environment, as a social activist and justice climate activist. Ayaka.
Yes, I apologize for that brief interruption. My Wi-Fi cut off, but basically to take it where I left off, I'm going to explain to basically from a young person's perspective in South Africa that lives in a middle class, actually lower middle class community, and what I see on the day-to-day basics when I live. Since I go to school in Khayelitsha, that isn't the best neighborhoods in South Africa. And one trend that I noticed from young girls, young women around, when they're talking about their boyfriends and they're talking about what they want to be in life, we always find that women perpetuate the patriarchy. I see in these, statistics just came out now about pregnancy and the ages of pregnancy. And instead of us asking ourselves, let's not villainize the woman. Let's ask ourselves, who made that girl pregnant? Who made that 13-year-old girl pregnant? Who made that 9-year-old girl pregnant? We don't ask ourselves those questions. We always judge the girl and ask them, why are you loose? Why would you fall for a man that age? Why would you do that to yourself? You're so young. But then that's the problem. We should not be blaming women, because this system has programmed our minds from a young age that we are objects and will never be more than objects. I see how the girls speak in my neighborhood, how they speak in my classroom, saying, oh my gosh, my boyfriend hit me. And they're glorifying it like it's something normal, something to laugh about, something that it means that their boyfriend cares. It means that they have these strong, dominant boyfriends, where in fact it is something that is breaking them down every single day. And that's the question that I have in my mind. If the women that are in the abuse every single day don't see it as abuse, who are we complaining to? Who will save us as women? Gender-based violence is not something new, especially in South Africa. And those numbers are still climbing every single day. Yet we are protesting, we are fighting, we are having webinars, we are making it clear. Everyone knows that South Africa is a country that is full of femicide. Yet we see little change in regards to that. My thing is, who are we waiting to save us? Are we waiting for the men to save us? Are we waiting for men to decide, oh no, it's wrong to hit a woman, let's stop hitting women? Who are we asking to change the system? I mean, it's very clear that you can't ask the person that's causing the problem to fix it, because they don't see errors in the system. They don't see errors in the problem that you're presenting. Now I'm asking a woman, I'm asking women that are older than me, how do we break the cycle? How do we break this patriarchy? It's clear that we can't let the men do it. It's clear that we can't, even though there are men that are feminists, there are men that are with us in our struggle, but we are the ones that are living this reality, and we are the ones that have to provide solutions to this reality. And that's what I find every day. Who are we asking to save us? Are we asking the men? Are we asking ourselves? Are we asking older women? Where do we start? Where are the starting points? We've been talking about this way too long. We've been complaining to the government. We've been complaining to the president. We've been complaining everywhere that's actually possible. Yet we see little to no change at all. Also, I see in the climate change field that gender is an important factor that is also not being factored in. The fact that 70% or more, or the majority of farmers in Africa are women, and they are small scale, but then we see little of them being part of the conversations. We see little to no farmers or women that are in these discussions that talk about agriculture. We see little to no women being part of the decision-making process. The table is always surrounded by men, powerful, dominant men, predominantly white even. So my question is where's the divide? Where's the stop? Where do we start as young women? Because personally, I'm frustrated as a young woman in South Africa. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to look. I just see chaos all around me. And I'm just praying that I won't be next, because it's looking like every single day a young person is being targeted and is being abused. But what are we doing about this? I think it's time as women that we take back our self-autonomy, and we take back the responsibility to care for our other women. Instead of mothers hating their daughters, instead of mothers judging their daughters, instead of women in the community gossiping and saying girls are loose, how can we guide those misguided girls? How can we stop saying the blame is on the woman and shift the blame to someone else and fix the problem at its root or at its center? For my last point, I'm going to say is that I'm so incredibly grateful to be part of the generation that I'm in right now. It's very clear to see that Gen Z is not a generation that is going to sit down and take things lightly. We see this in the immense movements that have been rising since 2020. We see this in the Black Lives Matter movement. We see this in the movement where people are fighting for their gender, the LGBTQ plus community, where we see this, that people that are young are starting to question the things that older generations used to sit by and be complacent of. We see that we're in a generation and we are in a revolution. For example, even in the climate movement that we find that women are the leaders. We see Greta Thunberg, she's the face of the movement. And that she's a woman and she's a young woman. And now it's being very clear that our gender doesn't factor in how much we can handle in society. It's being very clear that women can lead, women can be productive, women can have the forefront and lead in a very beautiful way. We're seeing this in the climate movement here in South Africa. We see me speaking, me being confident, me knowing that I will be heard as a young woman and not being looked over. So I definitely feel like we're in a revolution and we're in a space of time where it's very crucial for us to see how we move forward. Young people are noticing the trend. Young people are getting tired. And in South Africa, I'm afraid we have a young population. And once young people's minds start clicking and once young people get tired and fed up, the country will go down. And that is my fear, honestly speaking. We're getting tired of asking the older generation to fix its mistakes. We're getting tired of asking adults to do their job and be adults and protect us children. It's being very obvious that self-vested interests are the top priorities of people that are put in power to protect us. So now is the time where we ask ourselves, how do we move forward? How many more webinars are we going to have until we actually make tangible change? So I definitely feel like the place that we are in right now is a place where we have to choose whether you sink or swim. We have to choose, are you going to be part of the revolution? Are you going to be fighting with women? And are you going to be fighting with young people? Are you going to be fighting for the future of our country? Or are you going to be part of the group that is complacent and will be the enemy at that time? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayaka. I think you've ended the panel discussion on some really critical issues in terms of where we go and what's the view and how young people are feeling. I can really understand that there's a sense of the need to be revitalized, the need to basically say to the older generation that we can't necessarily only rely on ourselves. You've got to basically also give us some optimism, some hope, and so forth. And on that note, I want to basically open up the discussion and open it up to the audience who are in the webinar. Please, if you want to drop your questions in the chat room, in the comment section of the platform. If you have any specific question for any of the panelists, or you have a general comment, or you have a general question, just to raise it, share your experience, and so forth. But let me just open up now to all the panelists, and if you can get them onto the screen, it'll be great. If not, that's fine. But I just want to start off with the critical point and what I think both Prof. Mabel and Ayaka had essentially brought to the fore, and that is, are we really having a discussion that's going to be taking us forward in terms of having some kind of tangible outcome, some kind of tangible kind of implementation, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of how we reorientate our discussions, reorientate what we want to achieve as outcomes? Because I think the general sense I'm getting is that we keep having the discussions, we keep having a continuous loop of discussions, but we want to see what the impact is. And if I can open up with this question to all of the panelists, we're going into a local government election, and we've been only talking about whether this local government election is going to happen this year or it's going to happen next year. We are also talking about whether we are entering a kind of stalemate in terms of fatigue of these election campaigns and the election manifestos. We've heard political parties, some of them raise questions about, is it possible for them to campaign and how they're going to campaign, and whether or not this kind of model and this modality we have in the electoral landscape of campaigning, is that going to be an advantage or disadvantage? Because now with the COVID-19 regulations, you have restrictions around how the campaigning will be formulated and articulated. You saw that there were candidates that had to be submitted to the IEC by 9:30 p.m. on Monday evening. What do you think is the crisis in terms of our electoral model when it comes to including women in terms of not just representation, but the qualitative issue around representation? I mean, I open it up as a lead to other questions that I want to pick up. And if all of the speakers can put their cameras on, we can have you all on the screen. But I want to start with that, because it seems to me that we play a lot of lip service to this electoral process, to the 50-50 representation. I think, Mabel, you've opened up that debate about representation and whether we're meeting those benchmarks. But is it enough? Is representation enough? What more do we need to think about? We've got these political parties. We've got councillors that are going to be coming on board. And I like the point around taking back your self-autonomy, Ayaka, young people. Bringing young people into the vibrancy of this electoral landscape. But is that enough? What else do you expect of these political parties? Are these political parties just there for, as you said, Ayaka, self-interest? Or should we be thinking about how do we hold them accountable? Because for me, one of the bigger questions I have is we don't see our councillors unless they want to come and get our vote. Already I'm hearing anecdotal evidence of people using the unfortunate events in July in KZN to try and play a different type of politics, or rather try and play a reactive politics. We have a serious crisis in this country. If you look at the South African survey, barometer survey that the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation just published, we just don't have a crisis of the ruling party or of institutions and trust in institutions. We have a crisis across the political body of this country. And where do we put women in this kind of institutionalization of patriarchy, but also this kind of male-dominated or first citizen approach? And I think I want to gaze, how do we hold these people accountable? Is it enough to say, I won't vote for you, I won't go to vote? How do we change that? And how do we get people like Ayaka to be that voice of self-autonomy to get the discussion going around that representation? So I leave it open to however you want to do the thing. I'm not going to be prescriptive and say Prof. Mabel or Ayaka Mabel. It's up to you. Whoever wants to just jump in, because it's a conversation.
Okay, Sanusha. Sure. I think from where I sit, I am pining for a situation where it is possible to matter, no matter what constituency you are in. This is why I threw in when I was talking about these rigid strategies. We'll come to political parties in a moment, but these rigid strategies that are talking about pillars and law enforcement and all of these kinds of things. And I don't see my church group in it. I mean, I actually am advocating for a different way of regulation, because I think women suffer a lot as subjugated space and a subjugated group of citizenry from just being reduced to numbers and being subjected to regulation. Unless we devise a way of working with women, with groups generally, including groups that are going to discuss issues of masculinity, and make those major projects in serious strategies, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to be doing anything different. We're going to just be replicating policy, reproducing policy and strategies forever. That's one element, a different way of engaging and making constituencies matter, whether they're a tax association or whatever. Secondly, I think that political parties must be put under pressure. Actually, we need forums and engagements with political parties, not to come to us to sell representativity. And so what? I mean, that was supposed to be a basic to be achieved anyway. But to tell us what are the new ways of working that they are advocating. For example, I'm actually always expecting someone to challenge me when I seem to be advocating communality of land, because I can't wait to then ask people, are you happy with the banks and the way that they treat women and the way that they treat Black people? And are you happy with the fact that I've had land as a woman in under traditional leadership and done things with my small scale agriculture, and no one actually wants to recognize that, because we are all hung up on freehold is fashionable. So I am pining for new ways, one of engagement by, if we are too formatted in terms of getting into power via political structures, political parties, then at least political parties, for me to be able to vote to them, must engage me on things that matter. So maybe I'll stop there for now, and then we can take it further.
Maybe,
If I may, I'll just
go for it.
Okay, I was just going to mention as well that, at least in my experience working and interacting at least with women in local government, some of the stories they tell about the lack of support, especially at the local level as councillors, even at mayoral level, but even more so for councillors who are the face of the party in the community at the community level. The level of violence against them is astounding and heartbreaking. Some are killed, and they don't have, in my opinion, enough spaces to talk about the challenges they face, especially as women in leadership. Now, if the Prime Minister of Australia and the current WTO head, Ngozi Iweala, have published this book that speaks about how women in leadership are judged more harshly than men, bullied by the public, intimidated by the public. What more at the local level, without the bodyguards and the security and the PR personnel in the same, in terms of resource availability to help them engage with the communities to be protected and still be able to perform? I think it's a very difficult position for them. Not to mention the need for counseling and these safer spaces just to tell their stories. Because I think we actually don't understand what women are going through who dare to participate in politics. Firstly, I was disturbed when I once heard a Tanzanian parliamentarian in a meeting say, she was questioned about her credentials because she was a single woman, striving to occupy political office. In their opinion, she was either sleeping with someone in a higher position to be able to even strive for such a role, or she had found other ways, quote unquote, to have the opportunity. But in reality, she had served in her community, demonstrated resilience over a number of years to even be able to run for that role, to win and to occupy that seat, So women face challenges both before they run for office, while they are in office, and after that. Look at the reputations of strong women. I know we have our opinions about Margaret Thatcher, but if we now look at history and who wrote that history, she was in office dominated by men. The people that worked with her were men. The people who criticized her were men. And I'm not supporting her policies, but was it really a fair assessment if we start to critique the discourse that drives what women are doing in the realm of policy and politics. And I think it's time for us to start asking the questions, who's writing and dictating the narrative about women in leadership? Are women telling their own stories? Largely not. But hashtag women leaders do exist. They do. And they're doing amazing work. The other challenge we have, I mentioned earlier very briefly, is that sometimes as women, when we occupy positions of influence, because of the politicization of gender, which you begin to understand when you're in that space, is that if you don't toe a certain line or occupy that performance role as the woman in the room, seen and not heard, which I've heard from many women who we think have influence, but in reality, within their political parties, they've been told, you must be seen, not heard. You must be seen and not heard. What kind of transformation are we really driving? Is it real, equity and inclusion? Having a seat at the table? That's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough. And the women who are in those positions, I think, should have the freedom and the remit to open up the space for mentorship and to bring more women into the space and not to occupy a seat for too long. Because then the problem is, I have this power. I don't want to let go because I worked so hard to get here. It's kind of like our liberation movements. We worked so hard to get here and now we don't want to, share the space. And it's a problem.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem. And it's threatening the fabric of our democracies. I'll leave it there.
I mean, I think you've given a nice segue for Ayaka to come in as a young person. Great stuff. Go for it.
Yes, actually, I agree with the points that you, Pearl, and Mabel have raised. And it's coming very clear to me that it has to start at a psychological level. We have to start at the basics. As a woman, as a young child, as a daughter, how are you seen in your household? How does your mom respond to you compared to your brother? How does your mom respond to you compared to your other siblings? I feel like if it starts there, we'll be able to train women psychologically that they are not inferior to men and that they can do whatever they wish to do. Because what I've noticed is that, for example, we can fight to have a position and to have a seat at the table. You can have that seat and be surrounded by men, but if you do not know how to participate in that space, that seat is useless. If you're going to occupy that space and not understand how things work and still have those fundamentals and still ideologies that I have to be quiet because I'm a woman, even though I am in this powerful position, that means that we're not really moving forward. So my thing is, where do we start? Do we start with the mother? Do we start in the classroom? Do we start, where do we start as women to train our minds psychologically that we have to stand up? And there's also this point that the fact that women are still responsible for unpaid social care work, and the fact that since we want to be in these spaces and we still have those responsibilities at home, if we finally get what we want as women to be in these spaces, what happens to that work, that social unpaid work? Who does that work? Is it only going to be women? Are we going to be sharing with the men? Or should things like social services, like education, preschool, health systems all be free for people to work, so that if I'm going to work and I know that I'm a woman, I'm in a powerful position and I don't want to hire a nanny, or I can't afford a nanny, I should be able to say, you know what, I can take my child to this creche and then they will looked after and they will be taken care of and not have the burden that since I'm the mother, I have to nurture them. Since I'm the mother, I have to cook for them every night. Since I'm the mother, I have to take care of them. So my thing is how do we move forward and how do we break that psychological barrier in women's heads that I will forever be inferior, I will forever be an object, and I have to be the neck of the household? So that's the thoughts that are just echoing in my head.
Great stuff. I think these comments are really great. Let me get a little bit more specific to each of you and ask a specific question based on the presentation and of course your backgrounds and so forth. Let me start with you, Mabel. I'm fascinated. You're a professional musician. We've been talking a lot about women in politics, women in the professional space a lot. But outside of the leadership questions, outside of the politics and the governance and the empowerment, what has been your experience breaking into this music sector in terms of where you are and the kind of narratives that you are shaping through the music that you are writing, performing, engaging in? You talk a lot about lived experiences and telling stories. So just, a bit of that. I would love to hear that.
Wow, I've been really privileged to be able to still pursue music and use music as a tool to deliver, especially positive messaging, music with a message that encourages, brings hope to our society because of the way things are so difficult everywhere across the board. And I think for many women musicians, it's not an easy space, especially if you're doing it full time. And I perform in my free time. I write in my free time. I record in my free time. I don't have the pressure of gigging, every day and having to earn an income. Some of the informal traders that I'm talking about, that may not be registered as a business are professional musicians. I have many friends over the since the COVID-19 pandemic started, but even before that, who are really struggling with very few safety nets to support them because they haven't been able to perform in many venues. Venues have closed down. And I know musicians have been rallying together to raise issues about this, but I don't think they're really being heard. And, in another lifetime, maybe I would have pursued it full time. But I think that women, for instance, don't have to be boxed into one thing. Often, we're told you have to be like this, so you have to be like that. No, you don't. You can be who you are. Bring your authentic self into every space and every sphere. I had to learn that. I'm still learning that. And the reason I say that is because often I wouldn't tell people I'm a musician. It wasn't even in my bio. And then my peers challenged me and they said, May, because I go by May Sotola in my artist spaces. And, they said, May, why don't you tell people that you're a musician? It almost comes up as an afterthought. And I thought, wow, I've never thought to do that in the academic space, in the policy space, in the political space. I always think, it's one of those things. And they said, no, own your identity, own your space. There's a powerful book called Own Your Space for women. And I thought, okay, I have to do this more. So it's meant that I'm a believer. So I felt that, God started opening up opportunities for me to share the gift that I have in unlikely places. So at one African Union high-level dialogue, someone in the organizing team knew that I was a musician. There was a gap. In fact, no. What happened is when I started, I was supposed to speak on gender equality in the workplace. I won't take much longer. And one of the organizers said, May, we've heard speech after presentation after dialogue after dialogue. Please, can you sing? Just break into song. Break this monotony. We're bored. And I said, are you sure? Because they're like heads of state here and like serious people. I don't think they want to hear me sing. And he said, no, please sing. And it was a man who opened up the space for me, even gave me the idea to own the space. It was very far. I was concentrating on my notes and what I had to say. So before I said anything, I just sang, Nkosi sikeleli Afrika, malubagalitsu pondolwayo, izwa imithandazo yethu. Nkosi sikelela thina usapho wayo. And I was like, sometimes we just have to be ourselves to open up space for other people. Then someone else will be confident to do the same. When people see Ayaka occupying her space, Prof. Sotola, yes, Professor Pearl Sotola, occupying her space, knowing how difficult it is for women academics. Then they say, I can do it too. I can be myself. I'm sorry for speaking for too long.
No, I think you've just given us a whole renewal of hope and optimism. And the fact of the matter is, you just sent shivers down my spine when you sang that song. I can't think of a better way for you to epitomize what the value addition is of this discussion. And I'm hoping that Prof and Ayaka will also come up with their experience around how they occupied the space outside of just the professional space. Please, either one of you, go ahead. Just share what Mabel just gave us. I think we keep hearing the same narratives around policy, but share the narratives outside the experience of policy and in your space, that you go forward and you open up that space for everybody in terms of owning your identity. Ayaka, maybe, as the youngest in the room, I think we all feel very privileged having you on this platform and taking a lot from you as the empowerment that you brought to yourself.
A major part of my identity definitely comes from my mother. Can you hear me properly? It's okay. A major part of my identity comes from my mother. My father passed away when I was about 6 years old. So she's always been the dominant figure in my life. And I was privileged enough to have a mother that was resilient, hardworking, independent, and always did things her way. Because I feel like if I did not have that guidance from a young age in my life, I would not be here right now. The fact that I was able to grow up in a household where I knew that my opinion mattered, that I am validated in what I do, and that I am powerful, and I don't need to compare myself to a man. I am powerful in my own way, in my own light. And that really made me see how powerful and how important it is to have a female role model in your life. It might not be your mother, it might not be your uncle, like your auntie, it can be anyone, but as long as it's a powerful female role model, you will have the right ideologies in your heart while you're growing up. Because every day I call my mother, she's currently in the Eastern Cape at the farm, and I'm here in Cape Town. I call her every day to make sure we reach out. Even before this call, I called her, Mom, it's time for the conference. We're talking about women. And she was so proud. She was saying that I'm going to do great. And I have the point in my heart, really, don't doubt yourself, do well. And honestly, that's where I draw my strength every single day. I saw that from a young age. If you have that support system, you will have a different ideology and a different outlook on life. And for me personally, that's how I feel like my identity represents itself. I've never been in a space where I feel intimidated by men because I know where I come from. I know what I bring to the table. I know my lineage. I know the powerful women that came before me. I know the shoulders I'm standing on. And that simply does not allow me to be intimidated by a male. And that's not to say that I'm competing with male counterparts or that I'm trying to outdo them or be smarter. I'm confident in myself, my skills, and what I bring to the table. And if more of us young women can learn that, we can be powerful. Because look at me as a young girl, living with my mom, here in Cape Town. I didn't even go to Ivy League school. I went to a normal school, and yet I find myself in spaces where I'm able to speak to presidents, where I'm able to engage with ministers, where I'm able to engage at policy level, places I never saw myself, and I'm only 19. It just shows us how powerful we can be as women if we actually believe in ourselves and have people that are women that are supporting our dreams. Because that way we'll never have to compare ourselves, and we'll be authentically ourselves at our highest potential, and we'll be able to make mountains move. So if this can happen to me, what's stopping other young people in South Africa? And to not be mistaken, I definitely don't want people to be like me. I don't want people to try to assume my identity, be comfortable in your identity. As Mabel said, how can I be myself to make sure that you are comfortable enough to be yourself as well and excel in whatever that you do? So that's my part of contribution.
I think you're going places. That's all I can say. And authentically, Ayaka is going places. Nobody else.
Nobody else.
I'm giving the floor to Prof. I know we're running out of time, but I just don't want to stop this incredible narrative we've got here going. But Prof, after hearing Mabel, Ayaka,
Oh, I am allowing myself to be inspired, honestly, and in a way that confirms my own journey and suspicion that actually we don't have, when we say we're knocking at spaces to get in, we don't want to get in the terms of the space. We want to get in as ourselves. I've seen women being asked to toe the line with regards to emotions in the workplace, or all sorts of things that women go through for being women in the workspace. And I think that women must refuse, because we are half the population, and in some countries more than half the population, and we are bringing something to spaces that matter to us. And that has been my relationship with academia. And I know you know this, Sanusha, that academia, in as much as it projects itself as this liberal space of thinking and of independence, it actually is not. You are asked to publish or perish. You're asked to follow specific, very rigid and stringent ways of being judged. You are asked even things that are not dependent on you, as to how much have you been cited. I mean, we Black women, how much have you been cited? Like people out there want to hear from you. All of these kinds of things. And my journey has been to chart my own scholarship, actually. To publish it, even if it won't be published by those people who want to overly screen me in their own way. Because in the end, Ayaka will stumble upon it and use it and see what I really thought, rather than toe the line too much to a certain guru. So I please the gurus just enough to stay in the system, but I actually do what's genuine for me. So that is the story of women, and I'm really hopeful when I hear people like Ayaka, honestly, because I've said it in other forums as well. I pin my hopes on this generation, and for as long as this new upcoming generation are mad in an informed way at us, we are likely actually to get into a space where we are salvaged from our own selves in a way. Thank you very much for this.
I think that was just profound. I like the fact that you're challenging scholarship and academia, because I think too often those peer review articles and those peer reviews come back and they're not necessarily about you and your content. It's about other people's egos and their identities. But I'm not going to say anything more. I think you all have summed it up really well. I'm not going to try and sum up anything, because I won't be doing you a service or a justice in terms of what you put out there. Suffice to say, I think the real issue that comes out for me, before I hand over to Paul, the director of the DDP, to make his closing remarks, is that the first citizens of the world have been put on notice that no longer are they going to be the first citizens of the world, and that they are no longer going to be pushing their agenda in terms of what they think women empowerment means and what they feel women empowerment should entail. So I think the pandemic has made us realize that we left the world too long in the hands of first citizens, and it's time we take back that self-autonomy and reorientate Earth, because she's very angry with us at the moment. Paul.
Paul is scared now.
I ain't scared. In fact, I'm very excited about listening to these awesome thoughts, and really appreciate all of you for really doing a great job in sharing your thoughts very candidly and saying what needs to be said. And I think that's the first beginning process of where we need to move towards really making sure that South Africa is safe for all women, but not just being safe, but also a space for them to explore their gifts and really live up to their potential. And I think I agree 100% with the thought that we have enough policies, we have enough strategies. Can we now, please, for heaven's sake, do better by implementing what we've already spent a lot of years and hours trying to think through how best we can be able to address these issues. And I think the action part of implementing those policies is what really we've been lacking, and has contributed to the ongoing and undesirable situations that we're constantly experiencing in our country. And for me, it's still a very hurtful space to even think about the levels of atrocities that we see against women in our society on a daily basis. But then it's also a call to action for organizations like DDP and others who really appreciate and accept that women have a role to play in development and have a role to play in leadership in both public and private sectors and even civil society, and be able to support every process that needs to be done to make sure that their voice is heard, respected, appreciated, and given a chance to actually influence the direction for development and our political leadership in our country, including corporate leadership and in other spaces like academia. And it's very important that not only is not done by women alone, but men who also believe in so. And I think for us as an organization is to say that we are up for that call, and we're ready to continue this kind of conversations in platforms such as this one and in other spaces where we have opportunity to inspire this kind of brave conversations that needs to ruffle the status quo as best as we can, so that we can see movement while at the same time organizing and reaching out to all other stakeholders to make South Africa a safer place for all women to feel that they can live their lives here and express their full potential. At the same time, also address all these atrocities that we see as a collective, so that we can be able to live to the reality that South Africa is free for all. And with those few remarks, I want to thank you, Sanusha, for holding and moderating the conversation, for Prof for making time to be with us, and Marvel and Kai, I really appreciate that, for sharing your thoughts, and my colleague Lynn for standing in for me. I really do appreciate it, and I wish you well this afternoon, and looking forward for the next webinar that we're going to have together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, colleagues. Fantastic stuff. And we look forward to the next conversation and keeping this conversation alive.